She whispered, "He chained me to the stove." The sheriff burned down the man's barn. That same night, the wind that swept through Eden Hollow that afternoon carried more than dust. It brought silence, the kind that presses against your skin like damp cloth. Ada Warren sat motionless on the examination table, her skirt bunched neatly around her ankles, hands folded in her lap as if she were in church. Her face, pale and rigid, didn't flinch when the doctor pressed his fingers near the raw patch on her side. The burn was deep, angry, the color of overripe fruit left in the sun. "It looks like stove metal," Dr. Lang muttered without looking up. Ada didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the slatted window across the room, where sunlight spilled through like jail bars. "Was it an accident again?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice too quiet to be heard. She didn't offer more, and he didn't push. They had danced this routine before, silent waltzes of pain and shame. He handed her a salve, then stepped aside to let her redress in peace. By the time she exited through the back, the sun had dipped low enough to turn the town gold. Eden Hollow wasn't much, just two dirt roads that crossed each other, a saloon, a church, a schoolhouse that hadn't seen children in 2 years, and a sheriff's office made of warped timber. The people were as bent and weathered as the land itself. They kept their eyes down, their mouths shut, and their hearts guarded. Ada walked with purpose, but not urgency, clutching the medicine in her hands like it might break if held too tightly. She passed the general store, nodded to old Mr. Kilroy sweeping his porch, and turned onto the path that led behind the saloon. Inside, the saloon was starting to swell with evening life. Boots scraped against wooden floors, glasses clinked, and a tired piano groaned beneath calloused fingers. Ada moved like a shadow, unnoticed, except by one. Becca, barely 20 and too smart for her own good, was wiping down the bar. She saw Ada's bruises before she saw her face. The young woman blinked, and for a second the world stilled. They didn't speak then. Becca only nodded, subtle and slow. And later, after the saloon quieted, after the ranch hands staggered home and the poker game dissolved, Ada remained. She sat at a corner table with a mug of cold tea, the only thing she could afford. Becca approached and slipped into the seat across from her, hands flat on the table, like she was steadying herself. "You don't have to say nothing, Ada," she whispered, "but I'm here. I see you." Ada looked at her then, really looked, and something cracked open behind her tired eyes. She leaned forward, shoulders trembling, voice thin as thread. "He chained me to the stove," she whispered. Becca's mouth fell open. No words came out. 3 hours, Ada continued. "Said it was 'cause I let the stew burn. I couldn't move, not even to sit." Tears shimmered, but none fell. Ada didn't cry anymore. Crying was a luxury she had long since forgotten. Becca stood abruptly and turned away, unable to bear the weight of what she'd just heard. She didn't go back to wiping tables. She walked straight out the back, down the alley that smelled of whiskey and tobacco, and crossed to the sheriff's office. The door creaked as she entered. Sheriff Eli McCrae sat behind his desk, carving thin shavings from a hickory stick with a small hunting knife. He looked up, calm as a lake. Becca didn't bother with greetings. "She told me," she said, her voice tight. "She said he chained her to the stove today." Eli set down the knife, the curl of wood fluttering to the floor. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "Anything else?" he asked. "She couldn't sit," Becca choked, "and you know she's not the type to lie." He nodded once. That was all. Becca waited for him to say something more, to ask questions, to take notes, but he didn't. He stood slowly, as though his bones were made of iron, took his coat from the peg, buckled his belt, checked the bullets in his Colt. Then he walked past her, without another word. Becca turned, mouth parting, but no sound came. The sheriff was already in the street. The town was quiet again, unnaturally so. A church bell rang in the distance, one long, solemn tone for no apparent reason. The sky had turned the color of an old bruise. Eli walked with the kind of purpose that didn't need to rush. Past the saloon, past the general store, past the shuttered windows where people peered through lace curtains and pretended they saw nothing. He didn't go to Martin Warren's house. He walked straight to the barn. It was a large thing 2 stories high, packed with hay, tools, and secrets. Its side creaked in the wind like a moan. Sheriff Eli stood in front of it for a long time, watching it the way a priest might watch a coffin being lowered into the ground. Then he lit a match. The flames caught faster than anyone expected. They roared to life like they'd been waiting for years. Orange tendrils leapt into the sky, smoke curled up and blocked out the stars. People came out of their homes then, drawn like moths, mouths agape. Someone shouted, "Fire!" But Eli just stood there, his face warm in the glow, eyes steady. Martin Warren came running minutes later, pants half-buttoned, hair wild. "What the hell is this?" He grabbed a bucket from the well, but the others didn't move. No one helped. They watched. Sheriff Eli didn't speak. He didn't move. He stood like a monument to rage, silent, rooted, immovable. Martin turned to him, soaked in sweat and ash. "Was it you? Did you do this?" Eli blinked once. "Prove it," he said quietly, and then he walked away. By dawn, what remained of Martin Warren's barn were charred bones of timber and the acrid scent of justice no one dared name. The flames had long since died, leaving only smoke trailing upward in stubborn ribbons that refused to vanish. Ash blanketed the ground like snowfall, coating everything in a dull, lifeless grey. Chickens picked through the ruins in confusion. One of Martin's cows had broken loose during the night, and someone said they found it wandering near the creek, shaking. Martin stood in the wreckage with his fists clenched and his jaw tight, his boots blackened from stomping out embers. He hadn't slept. His shirt clung to him with dried sweat, and soot lined the creases of his neck. He hadn't said much to the neighbors who'd gathered at the edge of his property. Just a few short growls and curses through gritted teeth. No one got closer than necessary. No one offered help. He'd spent the early hours circling the barn like a vulture, looking for clues, for footprints, for someone to blame. And though he hadn't found a single boot track that didn't belong to himself, he had made up his mind before the sun broke over the ridge. He stormed into town just as the church bell rang 6. The sheriff's office sat quiet and still, its door wide open, as if it had been waiting for him. Sheriff Eli McCrae sat inside, exactly as he had the day before, chair tilted back, boots on his desk. A book lay in his lap, some forgotten frontier journal with pages yellowed by time. His Colt sat to the right, gleaming faintly. Martin slammed a blackened hand on the desk. "Don't you play dumb with me, McCrae." Eli didn't look up. "Mornin', Martin." "Don't you dare mornin' me. My barn's gone, burned to the damn ground, and you were there. You didn't even lift a hand." Eli closed the book with care and set it aside. Then he leaned forward slowly, setting both boots back on the floor. "I saw a barn burnin'. Yes," he said plainly. "Not much left to do once it's lit, is there?" "You think I'm stupid?" Martin snarled. "Everyone saw you walking there last night. You didn't go to my house. You didn't knock. You went straight to the barn and walked away after. Then it caught fire like magic." Eli didn't flinch. Maybe the wind caught a lantern. Maybe a rat chewed through an oil line. Maybe lightning waited for the right night. Martin's eyes narrowed. "You trying to be clever?" "No," Eli replied. "I'm trying to enjoy my coffee." Behind Martin, a few townsfolk lingered near the boardwalk. They weren't pretending not to listen. No one was pretending anything anymore. Martin's voice dropped to a growl. "You burned it. I know you did. And if I find even a trace of you near that barn—" "You'll what?" Eli asked, voice low, gaze finally locking with Martin's. "You'll chain me to a stove too?" The words dropped like a stone in water. The room froze. Even the wind seemed to hesitate outside. Martin's lip twitched. "I don't know what you've been told," he said coldly, "but my wife knows her place. She's just clumsy." Eli stood. Martin stepped back instinctively, just half a pace, and cursed himself for it. The sheriff didn't raise his voice. He didn't even touch his weapon. "You ever so much as bruise her again," Eli said, "and the next fire won't wait for wood." Martin held his stare for one long, silent beat, then turned sharply and marched out the door, muttering curses no one dared echo. Eli sat again. The town didn't talk openly about what happened that morning, but they didn't forget it either. The flames were gone, but the smoke lingered in people's clothes, their teeth, their thoughts. It settled into Eden Hollow like a new layer of dust no one could sweep away. Ada hadn't come into town that morning. She'd stayed behind the curtains of the Warren house, watching the ruins smolder in silence. She hadn't spoken since the night before. Her hands still smelled of salve and ash. When Becca knocked on her door near noon, Ada didn't answer right away. "Just wanted to check on you," Becca called gently. "I brought bread." Eventually the door creaked open, and Ada appeared in the frame, thinner than usual, like the smoke had taken something from her too. She accepted the bread without a word. Becca hesitated. "He didn't hurt you last night, did he?" "No," Ada said quietly. "Not last night." Becca looked past her shoulder into the dimness of the house. "Will you be all right?" Ada nodded, but her eyes drifted to the horizon where the barn used to be. "I think," she said, barely a whisper. "I heard it fall." At the general store, the townsfolk gathered loosely, whispering in clusters. "He did it," someone said. "That sheriff. I'd bet on it." "Man had it comin'," muttered another. "But burnin' a man's livelihood, that's near vigilante justice. Better than letting him kill her slowly." They all had opinions, of course, but none dared say them too loud. That was how things were in Eden Hollow. You whispered your truth and hoped no one called it out loud enough to hurt. By sundown, the town had returned to something resembling normalcy. The saloon was full again, the poker tables back in motion, the piano whining its sorrowful tunes. Eli sat alone in his office, a cup of black coffee cooling at his side, watching the window as if waiting for another fire. When Becca came by to refill his cup, she didn't speak. She just looked at him, nodded once, and left. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Sheriff Eli McCrae had never cared much for mirrors. They had a cruel honesty to them. At his age, they didn't just reflect, they revealed. The fine lines around his eyes, the grey peppering his dark hair, the old scar on his jaw that no longer felt heroic. But that morning, after the smoke had settled and Martin Warren had stormed off with ash still clinging to his boots, Eli stood before the cracked mirror in the back of his office and stared. He didn't see his reflection. He saw Caroline. It had been nearly 10 years since her death, but the memory of her voice, soft, tired, never accusing, still clung to the walls of his mind. Caroline had been everything Eden Hollow was not. Warm, forgiving, hopeful. She had believed in people, even when they didn't deserve it, especially then. And it had gotten her killed. They said it was pneumonia. That's what the doctor wrote down. But Eli knew better. She'd fallen down the stairs, or so said her husband before Eli, a man named Grant Tilson. Respected, church-going, always shook hands firm and looked a man in the eye, and he used to lock Caroline in the cellar when she spoke out of turn. Eli hadn't been sheriff back then, just a deputy too young to act without permission, too scared to lose his badge for pushing too hard. He'd looked the other way, just once, told himself she'd be fine, that she'd find help, that she'd survive it. She didn't. Her body gave out before her will did. And when the doctor signed that death certificate, the town moved on like she'd never existed. No one asked about the bruises, the broken rib, the way she flinched when someone raised a hand too quickly. Eli had watched them bury her, watched her casket sink into the earth, while Grant stood dry-eyed, then remarried a year later. He never forgot. And when the sheriff retired 2 years later, Eli took his place, not out of ambition, but out of penance. That night, standing in the haze of Martin Warren's burning barn, Eli hadn't seen Martin. He'd seen Grant. He'd seen the way Ada's eyes looked hollow and too quiet, the same way Caroline's had toward the end, the way her hands trembled when she poured tea, the way she spoke to the floor instead of to people, and it was that ghost, not of Martin, but of Caroline, that had driven him to strike the match. Now, in the stillness of morning, he leaned on the edge of the sink and whispered her name. Caroline. The wind outside the window shifted, and for a moment he thought he heard it echo back. Out in the fields beyond town, Ada walked slowly through tall grass, her shawl pulled tight despite the sun. Her body still ached, her side throbbed where the burn hadn't fully healed, but the open air gave her something her house never did: breath. She passed the blackened ruins of the barn without looking. There was nothing there for her, but the scent of justice she dared not acknowledge. She kept walking until she reached the fence line and stared toward the hills. She used to dream of riding past them. When she was young, she would trace maps in the dirt and imagine herself on trains, in cities, in places where no one knew her name or cared who she married. Now, even dreams felt heavy. Behind her, footsteps crunched the dry ground. She turned and saw Jonah Briggs approaching, hat in hand, eyes down. "I saw you walking," he said. "Thought maybe you'd like company." She didn't respond. Jonah cleared his throat. I wanted to say I'm sorry, for never speaking up, for not knocking on your door, for hearing things and pretending I didn't." Ada looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You weren't the only one." He looked up, startled. She wasn't angry, just tired. Jonah shifted his weight. "You ever need anything?" "I mean it, Ada. I'll come." She nodded once, then turned back to the hills. Behind her, Jonah lingered for a moment longer, then walked away. Ada didn't watch him go. Back in town, Sheriff Eli sat alone in his office, flipping through old case reports. At the bottom of the pile, yellowed and forgotten, was the folder he hadn't touched in years: Caroline McCrae. He traced her name with one finger, then closed the file. The past didn't die in Eden Hollow. It just waited for someone brave enough to dig it up. The scent of iron never truly left Ada's skin. No matter how many times she washed, how hard she scrubbed, it lingered, faint but present, a reminder. The iron chain had burned her more than the stove had. Not the heat, but the shame of it. The memory of cold metal biting into her wrists, of her knees blistering on the kitchen tiles, of her own breath fogging the side of the oven door while her husband sat in the next room drinking. She hadn't cried then, not once. She had learned over the years that silence hurt him more, that her voice, raised in protest, gave him reason. So she let the chain cut into her flesh without a word, but she remembered the sound, the click of the lock, the hiss of the flame, the weight of his boots walking away. Now that sound echoed in her ears as she sat on the front step of her house, her hands folded in her lap like a woman waiting for her own funeral. The sun glared off the scorched remains of the barn. The neighbors passed by and pretended not to see her, except one. Sheriff Eli McCrae stood beneath the shade of the oak tree near the edge of the property. He wasn't on duty, not officially. No badge today, no gun belt, just a long coat and his familiar unspoken presence. Ada didn't acknowledge him. She didn't have to. He had been standing there off and on for 3 days now, always at a distance, never intruding. She thought, at first, it was pity, but the longer he stood there, the more she realized it wasn't pity at all. It was vigilance. He was watching Martin. Inside the house, Martin Warren seethed. He hadn't shaved since the fire. His eyes were bloodshot from drink, and his knuckles raw from punching the barn's stone foundation. He couldn't prove Eli had done it, but he knew. And worse, he knew that Eli had no fear, no shame. The sheriff had stood there while the barn burned, just stood there, like a judge waiting for the flames to pass sentence. Martin's pride was gone. The town no longer bowed to him. They barely looked at him. The whispers that once hid behind closed doors now followed him into the saloon and back out again. He turned toward the kitchen. The chain still lay in the drawer, coiled like a snake. Ada wasn't inside. He checked the back. Nothing. He stepped onto the porch and saw her, sitting in the sun, her face calm, unreadable. And beyond her, the sheriff under the oak. The rage boiled over. That night, he drank himself into a storm. Becca saw it coming. At the saloon, she served him 2 glasses of rye without speaking, her hands trembling as she placed the bottle on the table. She noticed the way he stared at the wall, not at the people, the way he mumbled names to himself. Ada, he whispered. Eli, her and him. She made sure he paid. She made sure he left alone. Then she slipped out the back door and walked straight to the sheriff's office. Eli wasn't there. She turned on her heel and headed toward the Warren property. Her boots pounded the dirt faster than her breath. When she saw the sheriff standing near the tree again, she nearly collapsed from relief. "Tonight," she said. "It's gonna be tonight. He's not just angry, he's unraveling." Eli gave a slow nod, already knowing. "Go home, Becca. I can stay, I'll sit with her." "No," he said firmly. "You've done enough. She won't be alone." Becca hesitated, then turned and walked away. That night, a thin fog crept down the hill and settled across the town like smoke from a fire that hadn't started yet. Ada lay in bed, eyes wide open, facing the door. She knew. She had always known. Downstairs, Martin stumbled through the kitchen. He opened the drawer and pulled the chain free, letting it drag behind him like a tail. The oil lamp in his hand wavered, casting warped shadows across the walls. When he reached the bedroom, he didn't knock. The door opened slowly, but the room was empty. Ada was gone. A gust of cold wind rushed in behind him, and then a voice from the dark corner. "You shouldn't have kept her in chains." Martin turned. Sheriff Eli stepped into the light, eyes burning hotter than the barn ever had. Martin didn't reach for the chain. Not yet. He stared at the man who now stood between him and the empty bed, the oil lamp trembling slightly in his hand. Its flickering light danced over Sheriff Eli McRae's coat, over the hard line of his jaw and the steel in his eyes. No badge tonight, no gun drawn, just presence. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Martin asked, his voice raspy and swollen from whiskey. Eli didn't blink. "Making sure you don't end up in the ground before the week's out." Martin stepped forward defiantly. "You break into a man's home in the dead of night and threaten him. That's what we've come to now?" Eli's voice was low, even. "You threatened her every day for 10 years. You just did it with locked doors and no witnesses. She's my wife. She's not your prisoner." Martin raised the chain. "You gonna draw on me, Sheriff? Right here in my bedroom? Maybe put a bullet in my back too, just like you burned my barn?" Eli stepped closer. Close enough to smell the liquor and the smoke still clinging to Martin's shirt. "If I burned your barn," he said, "I'd have done it with you in it." The lamplight caught the edge of something in Eli's expression. Grief, maybe, or memory. It made Martin hesitate, just enough. "I ain't afraid of you," Martin hissed. "You're just another man too scared to keep his woman in line." Eli reached out and took the chain from Martin's hand before he could react. The sound of the link slipping free from Martin's grip was softer than it should have been, like a snake retreating into tall grass. "You should be afraid," Eli said. Then he dropped the chain to the floor, turned his back, and walked out of the room. By the time Martin staggered into the yard, the sheriff was gone. But the chain was still there, coiled on the floor like a curse. He didn't pick it up. He didn't move, not until morning. The sun rose slow and pale. The town stirred like it always did, slowly, warily, with half-lidded eyes and guarded mouths. But news traveled fast in Eden Hollow, even when no one said it out loud. "Sheriff was seen at the Warren place last night. Don't know what he did, but Martin looked different this morning. Heard something fell in the bedroom, something heavy." By mid-morning, Martin appeared on the boardwalk outside the general store, unshaven, hunched. People moved aside when he passed. He stopped in front of Becca, who was delivering a sack of flour. His voice came low, barely audible. "Tell the sheriff I want a word." Becca didn't look up. "Then find him yourself." Martin sneered, but he didn't argue. He walked across the street and into the saloon instead. Eli was sitting alone at the far table, nursing a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. He didn't look up when Martin entered, didn't react when the room fell into sudden, uncomfortable silence. Martin approached slowly. "I want this over," he said, standing behind the chair across from Eli. "Then leave," Eli replied. "I ain't leaving my land." "Then stay quiet." Martin sat. "You think this is done? You think burning my barn and taking my wife out of my house makes you a hero?" "No," Eli said. "It makes me tired." Martin leaned in. "She's got no money, no name but mine. She'll come back. They always do." Eli's voice turned sharp. "She won't. And who's gonna stop me? You?" The sheriff finally met his eyes. "No," he said. "She will." There was something final in that sentence, something so calm and cold it made Martin blink. Later that day, Ada stepped into the general store for the first time in months. She had bruises on her arms still, and the burn across her ribs made her wince when she moved too quickly. But she held her head high. She bought coffee, bread, a small knife. Paid in coins she had wrapped in a handkerchief from the saloon's till. Becca had pressed it into her palm that morning, with a nod. Outside, people watched her walk by. No one spoke, but one by one they stepped aside. When she passed the sheriff's office, Eli stood on the steps. He didn't speak either, he just tipped his hat. Ada nodded in return, her face unreadable, and kept walking. The door slammed so hard it rattled the windows. Ada barely had time to turn before Martin's shadow filled the entryway. His boots tracked mud and dust across the floor she'd just cleaned. The air in the room tightened. Every creak of the wood beneath his steps felt like thunder. He didn't say a word as he threw off his coat, but his silence was louder than any scream. She stood by the kitchen counter, one hand on the table, the other holding a loaf of bread she had just sliced. The blade rested beside it, a small kitchen knife, dull from years of wear. Useless. He stopped in the doorway to the kitchen, his eyes swept over the food, the coffee boiling gently on the stove, the flowers in a chipped jar by the window. The illusion of normalcy. "You think this makes it your house now?" he said slowly. "You think, 'cause you got the sheriff's pity and some coins from that barmaid, you're free?" Ada didn't answer. She didn't look away either. That was new. His lip curled. "I feed you. I kept a roof over your head for a decade. And you shame me in front of the whole town, walking around like some widow in black, like I'm dead already. I never asked for your name," Ada said. Her voice was flat, steady. Martin stared at her like he didn't recognize her, like she was a trick of the light. The Ada he remembered had kept her voice soft, her eyes low. This one didn't even blink. "You were nothing," he said, stepping closer. "A girl without a father, without a dowry, without a future. I took you in, I gave you a place. You gave me chains," she replied. That broke him. Martin lunged, grabbing her by the wrist. She gasped, dropping the bread. The knife skidded across the table but didn't fall. "I should have left you with your mother in the dust," he spat, squeezing tighter. "Should have let you rot in that shack." The sound of boots on the porch stopped him cold, heavy, purposeful. Sheriff Eli's silhouette passed by the window. He didn't knock. He opened the door and stepped inside without ceremony. Martin dropped Ada's arm like it had burned him. "Get out!" Martin barked, turning. "You got no right—" "She asked me to come," Eli said, calm as ever. Ada didn't move, didn't speak. She hadn't asked, but she didn't need to. Martin turned to her. "You brought him here?" "I didn't need to," she said. Martin sneered. "You think you're strong now, because he's standing in the doorway?" Eli's voice cut in, sharp as a blade. "She doesn't need me to be strong. She just needs you to leave. This is my house." "Not anymore." Eli stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Martin reached for the knife on the table, but Eli was faster. The sheriff's hand closed around Martin's wrist and slammed it flat against the table with such force the wood cracked. The blade clattered away. Martin cried out, trying to pull free, but Eli held him there, his voice low and deadly. "You touch her again," he said, "and I won't burn a barn. I'll bury you with it." Martin's face twisted, but he didn't speak. He saw something in Eli's eyes then, something far beyond law and duty, something personal, old, carved into bone. Eli released him. "Pack what's yours and go," he said. "You've got one day." Martin backed toward the door, cradling his wrist. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "She's poison. She'll turn on you next." Eli didn't answer. Martin left. The door shut behind him like a final nail in a coffin. Ada sat down slowly, staring at the knife. Her wrist throbbed, but her breath had returned. Eli poured her a glass of water and placed it on the table. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Not this time." They sat in silence. Then Ada asked, "Did you mean it? That I could stay?" "You already have." She looked at him, not with gratitude, not with tears, with recognition. Outside, Martin stood on the edge of his own porch, breathing hard, staring at the town that no longer belonged to him. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He went to the livery and bought a horse with what little coin he had. By dusk he was gone, but fury, like smoke, never truly vanished. It lingered in the rafters, it settled in the lungs, and in Eden Hollow it always found a way to return. The wind howled that night like it had something to say. It crawled through cracks in the shutters, whistled past the eaves, and rattled every loose nail in Ada's home. Her home. The word still didn't sit right in her chest, like a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit. She stood barefoot on the wooden floor of the kitchen, staring at the empty chair across the table. The house had never been this quiet. No boots stomping across the boards, no bottle hitting the cupboard, no voice demanding answers to questions she never had a chance to ask. The silence should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It was enormous, heavy. She boiled coffee out of habit, not thirst, laid out a blanket on the couch, though she had a bed upstairs. Old routines still clung to her bones. They'd been carved into her over the years, obedience mistaken for peace. The chain was gone now. Eli had taken it with him that morning when he returned one last time, tucked it into an old canvas sack without a word. She didn't ask what he planned to do with it. Maybe he'd melt it down. Maybe he'd bury it. Maybe he'd hang it above his desk as a warning. The night crept in slowly, the hours stretching like ghosts along the floorboards. At some point, she dozed off in the chair by the window. She woke to the sound of horses, not hooves on dirt, too soft for that, just the breathing, the shifting, the creak of saddles in the distance. She rose slowly, peering through the curtain. In the dark, shapes moved across the edge of her field. 5 riders, no lanterns, no voices, just motion. She reached for the rifle Martin used to keep above the fireplace. Gone. Of course it was. She blew out the lamp and stepped back from the window, heart racing. The knock came soft, too soft, and not at the front door. The back. She hesitated. Then came another knock, 2 slow taps, and a voice. "Ada." Her heart caught. It wasn't Martin's voice, it was Becca. Ada unlatched the door. Becca stood outside, shivering in her coat. Her eyes were wide, and she held a lantern low to the ground, its flame shielded from sight. "He's back," she said. "He's not alone." Ada's breath clouded the air. "What do you mean?" "They came in from the West Ridge," Becca whispered. "Didn't go through town. I saw them from the saloon's loft. Sheriff's gone. He rode out to White Bend for supplies. Won't be back till dawn." Ada's stomach sank. "He knew," she murmured. "He knew Martin would come back." Becca nodded. "He didn't want to leave, but we ran out of time." They both turned as a soft whistle cut through the night. Another rider now stood near the barn ruins, waiting, watching. In the town, no one stirred. Windows stayed shut, curtains drawn. The people of Eden Hollow knew better than to walk toward danger that didn't call their name. Ada didn't wait either. She pulled on her boots and coat, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. "I'm staying," Becca said firmly. No, Ada said. You need to get to the church. Hide there until it's over. I won't leave you. You have to. Her voice was stronger than it had ever been. Becca hesitated, then nodded. I'll light the bell tower when he comes. Ada's brow furrowed. Why? So he knows where to go when he rides back. They embraced, brief and tight, and Becca disappeared into the dark. Inside, Ada bolted the doors. She gathered what she could, a kitchen knife, a hatchet, a jar of lamp oil. She wasn't a fighter, but she wasn't prey anymore either. The knock came again, this time louder. Ada! Martin's voice called through the door, low and ugly. You got 2 minutes to open up or I come in swinging. She said nothing. Her hands trembled, but she gripped the knife harder. You think the sheriff's gonna save you again? He continued. He ain't here now. He ain't your shield. Another voice joined his. Hurry up! We got cold saddles and a score to settle. Ada stepped back into the shadow of the hallway. Then, from the hills, a light. The bell tower, flickering firelight, burst from its windows, cutting the night in half. Martin turned, and from the distance came the sound of hooves, fast, relentless. Becca had done it. Eli was coming. The men outside cursed and scattered, unsure of what to do. Inside, Ada moved quickly. She doused the floor by the entrance with the lamp oil. She lit a match. Then she waited. The back door shattered. A stranger entered first, one of Martin's riders, tall, thin, with a broken nose and a blade in his hand. Ada stepped out from the shadows and slashed with the knife. Not elegant, not trained, but desperate. He fell, stunned by the shock more than the wound. Martin barreled in behind him, roaring. He grabbed her by the coat and slammed her against the wall. You want to burn my life? He spat. Let me show you what that feels like. Then he froze. The front room was on fire. The doorway, the rug, the wooden chairs Martin had built with his own hands. He shoved Ada aside and ran for the flames. And at that moment the front door burst open. Sheriff Eli McCrae, soaked in sweat, his face wild with fury and fear, strode through the fire like a myth. He didn't speak. He raised his revolver and fired once. The bullet struck Martin in the shoulder, spinning him to the floor. Eli crossed the room and stood over him. Martin laughed, blood bubbling in his mouth. She's poison, he rasped. She'll ruin you too. Eli stared at him a long moment, then holstered his gun and dragged him outside into the dirt. The fire spread quickly, faster than Eli expected, faster than Ada had feared. What had started as a smoldering trap at the threshold was now consuming the entire front parlor. Flames licked up the curtains, caught the beams overhead, and bloomed orange and gold in the windows like angry dawn. Eli didn't have time to waste. He threw Martin into the dirt outside the house, where the man groaned and clutched his bleeding shoulder. Smoke billowed behind them in thick waves, and the heat from the doorway singed the sheriff's coat as he turned back. "Ada!" he called, voice hoarse. No answer. "Ada!" Then, coughing, a flash of movement inside. She stumbled into view, eyes watering, one hand over her mouth, the other reaching toward the back of the house where the fire had not yet spread. Without thinking, Eli charged back into the inferno. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating. Ada had wrapped a rag around her mouth and was trying to drag something from the mantel, a small carved box, blackened now by smoke. Eli caught her wrist. "Leave it." She shook her head. "It's my mother's." The fire snapped louder behind them. He didn't argue again. He grabbed the box in one hand and her arm in the other, and together they barreled through the hallway toward the back door, only to find it blocked. The heat had warped the wood, swelling it in its frame. Eli kicked at it once, twice. The third blow split it open just enough to let them squeeze through into the cold night air. They tumbled onto the back stoop, gasping. Ada clutched the box to her chest. Her dress was scorched at the hem. Her hair stuck to her forehead in damp clumps, but her eyes were open, focused, alive. The house behind them groaned like a wounded beast, its rafters shuddering, windows bursting in quick, violent pops. Flames spilled onto the porch, devouring it plank by plank. People began to arrive, slowly, hesitantly, drawn by the glow in the sky. The town gathered in loose clusters near the street, watching the blaze from a distance. No one brought buckets, no one tried to stop it, because they all knew. This fire, like the first, wasn't an accident, it was a sentence. Eli stood with his hands on his knees, catching his breath, while Ada leaned against the well, shaking. Becca reached her first. "Ada," she breathed, wrapping her coat around her shoulders. "Are you—" "I'm all right," Ada whispered. "It's done." Eli turned toward the center of the road, where Martin still lay in the dust, blood soaking into the earth beneath him. One of the townsfolk spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You gonna arrest him?" Eli didn't answer. He walked slowly to Martin, crouched beside him, and met his eyes. "You're leaving Eden Hollow," he said. Martin coughed. "You think anyone's gonna believe you didn't kill me here?" Eli leaned closer. "I don't care what they believe, but if I ever see you again, it won't be my badge you'll answer to. It'll be me." Martin's smile cracked, pained and bitter. "She'll always be mine." "No," Ada said. She had walked up behind Eli, still clutching the carved box. "You lost that right the night you put chains on me," she said. "And if I have to burn every wall you ever touch to be free, I will." The silence that followed was heavy, more final than gunshots. Eli stood, and Martin, realizing the crowd behind him was not going to defend him, looked away. At sunrise, 2 men from the town loaded Martin onto a wagon and sent him out toward the canyon pass. No one offered water. No one waved. Ada stood on the steps of Becca's boarding house, a blanket around her shoulders, her face turned eastward. Eli approached slowly, his hat in hand. "They won't speak of this in town," he said, "but they'll remember it." "I don't care what they say," she replied. He nodded. "That's how I know you're gonna be all right." She looked at him then, really looked. There was a gentleness in his expression that hadn't been there before. A man who had burned 2 barns, drawn 2 lines, and chosen a side. "I'm not ready to start over," she said quietly. "You don't have to," Eli replied. "You just have to begin." Later that afternoon, as smoke still curled from the rubble of her old home, Ada walked back alone. She sifted through the ashes, searching not for what was lost, but for what survived. Among the blackened beams and broken glass, she found the old iron stove. Half collapsed, its surface blistered, the chain was gone. She touched the scorched metal, then stood and walked away. She didn't look back. The ashes of Ada Warren's past smoldered for days, long after the flames died. The earth where the house once stood turned grey and soft, almost like the land was exhaling after years of holding its breath. And in that slow, smoky silence, Eden Hollow shifted, barely, but enough for those who were watching. Ada didn't cry. There were no tears to give. What she had lost in fire was not a home, but a cage. What she walked into now was not a future, but something better, the unknown. She stayed with Becca at the boarding house. A small room, thin walls, a shared wash basin, but it was hers, and it locked from the inside. The first night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair by the window, wrapped in a borrowed quilt, watching the sky turn from black to violet to gold. Every morning, she walked past the church, where the bell tower still bore smoke marks from the signal Becca had lit. She passed the general store, where old Mr. Kilroy no longer looked at her with pity, but with a quiet nod of respect. She passed the saloon, where no one asked her questions, no one needed to. Eli McCrae returned to his office like nothing had happened. He polished his badge, straightened the wanted posters, and added new bullets to the drawer that used to hold unopened letters from Caroline. He didn't speak of the fire. He didn't speak of Martin. But he spoke more often now, to Becca, to the townsfolk, even to Ada, when she paused on her morning walks. He'd wait on the porch, hat in hand, and offer her a nod. Sometimes she'd sit with him for a few minutes, just silence and coffee. Other times she'd keep walking. He never asked why. One day she brought him a pie, burned around the edges, uneven but fresh. He took it like a man being handed a loaded revolver. "You baked?" he asked, lifting an eyebrow. She gave a half smile. I tried. I'll try too then. And that was all. Jonah Briggs came by once with a sack of potatoes and a sheepish grin. I was just checking in, he said, shifting from one boot to the other. Didn't know if you needed help setting up your new room or anything. Ada looked at the potatoes, then at him. I'm not starting over, Jonah, she said gently. I'm just continuing. He nodded, understanding more than she expected. You ever need land? I got a piece I don't use no more, flat, near water. You could build there. Maybe, she replied, but I need to build something else first. He smiled sadly and left the sack on the porch. On the second Sunday after the fire, the church filled for the first time in months. Not for a sermon, no preacher had stayed longer than a season, but for a gathering. Eli stood near the back, arms crossed, watching. Ada entered last. She wore no black, no hat, just a plain brown dress and a ribbon in her hair. She walked to the front of the room and faced the people who had once looked away when she limped through the market or wore long sleeves in the heat of July. I don't want your apologies, she began, her voice quiet but steady. And I don't need your pity. The room was still. I know what you all saw. I know what you chose not to see, and I can't blame you. Fear makes cowards out of everyone, even good people. A few look down at their hands. I'm not here to punish anyone. I just want to say, I forgive you. A murmur rippled through the pews, but I won't be silent anymore. Not for your comfort, not for his, and not for the next woman who walks through this town with bruises hidden under smiles. She looked around the room. From now on, I speak. Then she stepped down, walked past Eli, and out into the sunlight. That night, Becca lit 2 lamps in the boarding house window. Not for safety, for celebration. Ada sat with her at the table, eating stew made with Jonah's potatoes, laughing, actually laughing at Becca's terrible singing. They talked about starting a bakery, or maybe a school, or both. They didn't talk about Martin, not anymore. Sheriff Eli rode out to the canyon ridge the next morning. The wind was sharp, the rocks jagged beneath his boots. He found the place where Martin's wagon had passed, saw the tracks veer toward no known trail. He stood there a long while, staring at the sky. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of chain. Not the whole thing, just one link, blackened, warped. He buried it beneath a pile of stones and walked away. Ada found the iron stove days later at the edge of the ruins, half buried in soot. She didn't cry when she saw it. She simply placed her mother's carved box on top, whispered something no one heard, and let the wind carry the rest. She would rebuild, not that house, not that life, but herself. And this time, the door would lock from the inside. Spring arrived in Eden Hollow, not with blossoms, but with stillness. The rains came late that year. The soil cracked underfoot, and the trees held their breath, like they too remembered fire. But something had shifted, not in the weather, in the people. Ada Warren no longer drew whispers. She drew nods, small, silent signs of respect. The same people who once avoided her eyes now moved aside when she passed, not out of pity, but deference. They no longer saw a victim. They saw something else, a survivor. She walked through town most mornings with a basket on her arm, not filled with bruises or secrets, but with bread, herbs, and hand-sewn sachets. What she didn't sell, she gave away. What she gave, she never asked to have returned. One afternoon, she paused outside the blacksmith shop. The window had a new pane. The bell above the door rang clear now. Inside, old Callum, the smith, was hammering out a curved iron rod. "For the oven door," he explained when he noticed her. "Becca said you might need one." Ada smiled. "It won't be for chaining anyone this time." Callum flinched, just barely, but then he smiled too. "No," he said, "it won't." A plot of land west of town began to change. Jonah Briggs had cleared it weeks ago, planted wildflowers along the edge, flattened the earth by hand. Ada came each afternoon with tools borrowed from half the town, a spade here, a hammer there. Becca brought nails. Eli brought timber. They never asked what she was building, and she never offered more than this: something that'll stay. By midsummer, a foundation took shape: stones, boards, a frame with wide windows and a long porch. No stairs, no thresholds too high. Every piece had a purpose. On the day the walls went up, children came from neighboring farms. Becca handed out lemonade. Jonah helped lift the beams. Eli stood by the gate, watching quietly, his badge glinting in the light. By sunset, Ada stood before her creation, a one-room schoolhouse, and above its door, painted in soft white strokes on a wooden sign, "The Hollow School for Girls." That evening, a small gathering formed on the porch. No speeches, no ceremony, just quiet celebration. Becca lit lanterns, Jonah brought music, someone brought apple pie, and Eli, as always, arrived last, still in uniform, but with no gun on his hip. He sat beside Ada, sipping coffee from a tin mug. "You named it well," he said, nodding to the sign. "It's not mine alone," she replied. "No," he agreed, "but it couldn't exist without you." They sat in silence, listening to laughter echo across the ridge. Then Ada asked, "Do you think they'll remember?" Eli glanced at her. "Who? The girls? The ones who'll come here? Who'll sit at those desks? Will they know what this place was built from?" He took a slow sip, then looked out toward the hills. "They won't need to know the details," he said. "They'll know it's safe. That's enough." Ada nodded, eyes glistening, not with tears, but with light. Weeks passed. On a warm evening in August, a stranger arrived in Eden Hollow. She wore a faded coat and boots too big. Her eyes were wide. Her cheek bore a yellowing bruise. She said nothing to the townsfolk who watched her pass, but she paused when she reached the sign. She touched the wood gently and stepped inside. Years later, no one would remember Martin Warren by name. His property became overgrown. The foundation of his house crumbled. Children dared each other to play in the ruins. Eventually, the wind erased what was left, but the Hollow School for Girls remained. The bell above its door rang every morning. Inside, girls learned letters, learned numbers, learned to speak loud and without apology. On the wall hung a small plaque carved in iron: "Chains are made to be broken, and silence never saves anyone." It had no author. But Ada remembered where it came from. Eli never remarried. He kept the sheriff's post for another 5 years, then retired quietly to a cabin near the creek. He came into town once a week for coffee, supplies, and quiet conversation with the woman who had taught Eden Hollow that some fires cleanse. On the night he passed, Ada sat on the schoolhouse porch with a lantern lit in his honor. No ceremony, just light. And Ada, she lived long, not happily, always, but fully. She taught, she wrote, she listened, and one spring morning she opened the schoolhouse door and found another girl waiting there. Small, thin, barefoot, no name, no words, just eyes full of fear. Ada knelt, smiled, and opened her arms. "Welcome home," she whispered. From that day forward, no one whispered about Ada Warren again, because now, when people spoke her name, they did it loud, proud, and free. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest scars, and the bravest acts are the ones no one sees. If this story moved you, or reminded you of someone who found strength in silence, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your reflections. And if you believe in stories that honor resilience, justice, and the power of reclaiming a voice, don't forget to subscribe for more.